Luke Vargas joins me today from Singapore. He's the chief foreign correspondent for Talk Media News. He also hosts the weekly foreign policy radio show and podcast, Wake with Luke Vargas. He's not just vacationing in Singapore. He actually has been there for the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit. And let's sort of start with the basics, Luke. I mean, talk about the setting, talk about the structure of the meetings. What can we glean, sort of, not so much from the actual paper that was signed, but from body language and kind of like the flavor of what's been going on there?
Well, I've been here for a while and I'm going to be here longer than apparently I need to be. There was some talk among the White House planners that everything was ready for this to possibly go into a second day. And as we'll talk about later, the fact that the rapport was strong, the deal making was occurring right even after the communique was signed. I'm not quite sure, and I wish I could have asked President Trump or someone else, why did this summit get cut off where it got cut off, but that's a matter for another day. This is the perfect place, in my view, for a high-stakes international summit. Singapore, maybe like a country like Oman, which also plays one of these unique sort of regional power brokering roles, has figured out most of its domestic issues, and kind of like a really good friend in a stable relationship is just there to help you out, and they're eager to pick up the tab and handle the security for foreign dignitaries. And I have to say that this is the safest city in the world according to a number of different studies. And I think in many ways that was palpable just going to all these conference events. I mean, there was security and a big military presence, but I've had encountered a more militaristic security approach to events in New York City. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Singapore is so safe. There's not a lot of other sort of factors that could really mess this whole summit up. The summit itself, not that interesting in many ways. It was not in my view, the pomp and circumstance even of the DMZ meeting between North Korea and South Korea in April, where you had all these military honor guards and music and all these photo ops. There was some of that yesterday, but not quite as much. It started with a 40-minute meeting face to face. Some people were sort of freaking out about this, historians and journalists, because there was no one else in the room other than the heads of state and their translators. I sort of saw this as a good thing. And these are two leaders that do need to get to know each other. And if the goal here is to avert, a nuclear war, then even spending 40 minutes talking about cars or New York City nightlife is better than not having a chance to look into your adversary's eyes. So that's how it begins. Then relatively boilerplate 2.5, 3 hours of bilateral meetings and culminating in this signed agreement. We'll get to that in 1 second. And body language, I think in many ways, Kim Jong-un's body language was the one to watch. I think we know how President Trump comports himself. I thought Kim in many ways was mirroring Trump at points. He's a man who's shorter, and that's always been a concern to his aides who wanted to make sure get overpowered when standing next to Trump. I thought Kim did a great job sort of matching his posture and gait. If you look at these photos of the two men walking down these colonnades at the hotel, they are almost walking in precise unison with each other. I think that's Kim mirroring Trump, not the other way around. And yet I also thought Kim in many ways is cognizant that, for his propaganda filmmakers, he wants to give them two types of summits, right? He wants to give them enough material that looks like he's affable, a genial man who's willing to play nice with an adversary, but also subtle physical gestures, putting his hand on Trump's back as they walk out of a room, that if any point the relationship goes south again, he can say, look, I was walking this guy around and leading him everywhere. And so I thought he was certainly very conscious of the way he was appearing on cameras.
Yeah, and maybe some elements of shared bonding over food. I mean, neither of them is particularly trim, and that may have been something that led to the furthering of the possibility of international peace negotiations. But let's get to the actual joint statement that was put out, right? Which my analysis, not to redo it all for you now, but my analysis was not unlike that of some others. I thought that most of what was in the agreement, the joint statement, was relatively unremarkable, mirroring commitments that have been both vague and unenforceable from North Korea in the past. And I'm curious, how was the content of that statement communicated to you guys, to press that were there?
Terribly. We were all stuck in buses, about 200 or so journalists of it. And this is not just, people like me or even sort of younger journalists. It was network news anchors, and Hannity was on another bus. I saw Roberts from Fox News, slumped against a window in a hot bus, waiting in traffic. I mean, all of us were stuck in the middle of Singapore traffic, trying to get to the press conference several hours later, and everyone's huddled around cell phones, trying to listen to the signing statements, and then trying to figure out what had been signed. I mean, the White House is spinning this already. Everyone's talking about a historic deal, and yet nobody knows what has actually been signed. And the White House doesn't send anything officially until 3 hours later, which is an hour into Trump's hour and 5 minute press conference. And
so if I understand correctly, Trump's doing the press conference. He's already well into the press conference, bragging about what was achieved, but the content of the statement that they signed had not yet been communicated to the press.
That's correct. I mean, Bloomberg, I believe, was the photography pool for the signing statement, and they had a telephoto lens, of course, and zoomed in. And one of their reporters, they probably kept it in-house for a minute and tried to analyze it, but then they sort of started circulating snippets of it. But I guess it's always possible that something else was signed or the formal agreement was different than what was brought to the table, so we didn't really report on it fully. But yeah, in the press conference, you can hear Trump sort of saying, everyone's seen this, and the reporters, including myself, started shouting back, no, we haven't. And finally, he gets the message and sort of says, hey, guys, send it to them. But they still don't do it for 25 minutes or something. It's back to the content of the document. It's really 4 paragraphs at the end of the day. The joke is that these things called joint communiques, of which this was a sort, was a communique to communicate, that it really didn't have much meat on it. The 4 key elements, 2 of them I think we can just toss out right away. They're very vague pledges to build a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, to revitalize the relationship. And there's nothing wrong with even saying you're going to revitalize the relationship, but one would have expected something more, a date for exchanging ambassadors, maybe a pledge to create a special interest section or interest section in Pyongyang and maybe one in DC. But again, that's very vague. There is a nuclear line which says that essentially, and there's no new language here, that they're going to stick up for the Panmunjom Declaration, which is from April. That's the document that was signed at the end of the DMZ summit. And that document also, if you go into that, it's a little bit longer than this, but it also just talks about phased disarmament and doesn't have any specifics. And that was purposeful. That document was crafted because there was an expectation that when Trump and Kim met, there'd be more robust nuclear language that would supersede it. And of course, that hasn't happened. And now the Panmunjom Declaration looks beefier than this. And the final point, which having just read the Korean Central News Agency, North Korean propaganda story about, appears like it was a spontaneous ask from Trump, which was relating to the POVs, getting back the remains of people, Americans who died or were captured in North Korea in the 1950s during the Korean War and whose remains are still there. And seemingly on the spot, according to the Koreans, Kim just acceded to this demand, and that was the 4th of the 4 paragraphs. But imagine this document, which already looks weak, lacking that paragraph, one that Trump was talking up repeatedly during the press conference. There isn't a lot of meat on the bone.
So let's talk about the press conference. You were in the 3rd row during the press conference, and there were a number of sort of unusual elements during this press conference. Once was that there was this video that we would have assumed was North Korean propaganda. It was actually produced by the White House, and we were talking about that on the program today. Also, there were references sort of offhandedly to additional provisions that Trump and Kim Jong-un sort of discuss verbally after the joint statement was signed, which of course exists nowhere on paper, and make this entire thing even more bizarre in my mind, which is that it seems as though the differences between this negotiation and prior negotiations exist only verbally and took place after the signing of the document that was published.
Yeah, well, that notion of a toss-in is a real estate term. I mean, you do these, once you sign something on paper, then the landlord is throwing in all sorts of concessions, and the new tenant is excited. Oh, the landlord's listening to my demands, but conveniently they're all verbal agreements, and you can never point to a lease and say, hey, you said you were going to dismantle that nuclear site or something like that, or install the new washing machine. So yeah, I mean, there's a huge gulf between the deal that's on paper and the deal President Trump seems to think about in his head. Let's talk first about the video, which startled all the reporters. There was no introduction to this, and it was a Korean video first. They played it in Korean and then looped it all back again. So it's like a 5-minute video played twice for us. And we did actually think it was a North Korean, multimedia material that was brought in. It had all the hallmarks. I don't know if you've seen, at risk of misidentifying the Donald Trump offspring, it's either Eric or Donald Trump Jr. who had a promotional video for a new like shared workspace living community in Dumbo in Brooklyn, and it looked a lot. I mean, I would be not surprised if it was the same sort of marketing team that did both of these videos. It has all this, it's the hallmark, stock footage of a basketball player with no uniform dunking on a court on a parquet with no logos on it either. It's like, and then shots of condos in South Beach. This was apparently a video Donald Trump played to Kim. And I was thinking, like, if you're a U.S. ally, let's say Botswana, who's like doing most things right, but they could be better. The economy's okay, but why not have a much more prosperous economy? Are you going to get any sort of presentation from Trump, like, become our friend and like we'll make you the country of your dreams? No, he's giving this pitch to a guy who's, a murderous dictator. That also seemed odd. And then we'll talk about the toss-ins. I mean, so. The biggest one, of course, is a concession from the U.S., which isn't anywhere on paper. And it's possible, like other things Trump has demanded of the military, that they are going to wait for some more formal order to, in this case, stop the joint military exercises with South Korea. And maybe they'll never actually get it. Certainly, Trump's decision to call these war games, to say they aren't necessary for American and Korean security, that they're too expensive, that Korea isn't footing enough of the bill. The Pentagon doesn't share those beliefs and is operating on the assumption that the military exercises are going to continue. The other toss-ins are concessions coming from North Korea, saying they're going to destroy a missile facility, saying that they're going to stop nuclear and ballistic missile tests. Again, that would be a really nice thing to have in writing because they have never agreed to that formally before. But Trump seems to think this, again, most important nuclear related matters of this whole summit it's fine to just leave those as sort of informal handshake agreements. And of course, there's an innocent explanation here and a cynical one. The innocent one being, look, these are very sensitive issues. They don't want to mess them up. They don't want to be premature in putting language out there that both sides might not agree to. And there is agreement on all sorts of fronts. They're just going to wait a few weeks to put it on paper. The much more cynical explanation, which I'm somewhat more inclined to believe, is that take out the POW demand that Trump apparently had the last minute, which did get moved into the agreement, and there actually isn't anything. These guys are not, positions are not converging despite all the recent meetings, and Trump goes up to the podium saying, shoot, I didn't agree to anything. Let me just sort of start talking about some unicorn deal that doesn't exist and will it into existence. And that would be concerning, of course.
Luke, in the limited time we have left, lack of nuclear knowledge seemed to be a theme of the press conference that happened there. In other words, Trump talked a lot hyperbolically about successes, but it didn't really seem as though he knew much about sort of how so-called nuclear works, how disarmament would work, or really any of the logistics.
He didn't. And he also, one of the details that would be really nice to have is, what is this ballistic site related to the engine program of the ballistic missile program in North Korea that they're going to destroy? Because there's already one called Ihari. It's the driver and engine facility, I think, and that's already slated for destruction. So if that's what it is, then this is really a nothing burger.
Major negotiation point.
Right.
He agreed to destroy something that's slated for destruction.
Right. The other bits are this tweet sent from Air Force One where Trump says now the nuclear issue is off the table. Of course, that's impossible unless the nuclear threat is removed or destroyed, which it hasn't been. And this also notion from Trump that, and I think he said this in the press conference, that, once you start to even partially take apart the nuclear program, the rest sort of just solves itself, which is the opposite of what experts say, which is that even if you get rid of all the material and all the launch sites, you still have in North Korea, at least, a whole, sort of rank and file of thousands of nuclear scientists who possess intimate knowledge of how to get back to that nuclear threshold again. And unless you retrain them or give them something else to do, they're a very potent political force in North Korea, and they also hold the keys to restarting that program. So the way he talks about nuclear weapons just signals he doesn't really know what he's talking about.
Luke, we're going to keep following it. Question, what has been the most interesting or unique food item you've had while in Singapore?
Gosh, I haven't been terribly adventurous. I'm trying to think. The Marriott Hotel, which sponsored the journalists, had buffets every night, and there were some odd sea creature salads without much garnish that I largely stayed away from. But other than that, it was sort of American-style dining for the last few days. So now that I'm caught up on sleep and all the diplomats have left town, I am going to branch out and see the rest of the city.
All right, Luke Vargas, Chief foreign correspondent for Talk Media News. Unseasoned sea creature salads. You heard it here first. That was one of the big revelations from the summit in Singapore. Luke, pleasure as always to be talking to you.
Thanks, David. Talk to you soon.